believe that Jesus came into the world to teach us how to be more fully human, to be better humans, to be the people we were created to be. I don't know if any of you have ever read anything by Cynthia Bourgeault. She's an Episcopal priest and spiritual writer, one of my favorite writers. And she writes about Jesus as a wisdom teacher. Wisdom teachers were quite common. A lot of the books in Scripture are wisdom literature. And wisdom literature is very different. A lot of parables, and the parables oftentimes have extremes in them. Because when something's extreme, people tend to remember it better. So Jesus didn't really expect anyone to cut off their hands and things like that. But it was talking about, let's talk in some extreme situations. Some pretty harsh talk in the parable today. It kind of sometimes sets aside that idea we think of Jesus always being meek and quiet and pleasant to everybody. As we've listened to the last few weeks in the Gospels, he hadn't been real pleasant with the leaders of the religious leaders of the time. He's been very critical. Why? Because they have co-opted the religion. They've taken what was supposed to be a priesthood of Levites who served the people, and they created, instead for themselves, lording it over the people, and pretty much making it difficult for the people. And Jesus was being very critical of that. Another point he talks about, we lost the heart of the law. The law isn't about all these things that you're trying to do. It's about something else. And that's what he wanted us to teach and learn. In today's readings, both in Isaiah and Matthew, we hear about vineyards. There are parables about the vineyards. Pretty clear, they're talking about Israel in the beginning, from Isaiah, and that Israel, God planted Israel, and in this area, he could compare it to a vineyard. The people knew about vineyards. They always talked about things that they understood. And things didn't go the way they were supposed to. The people strayed. Their leadership, especially, strayed. Same thing in Jesus' time. He's criticizing the religious leaders because they have strayed from the true meaning of religion. So, this is not uncommon. In human organizations, if you pay any attention, most human organizations, whether they're religious or secular, start out with a noble purpose. They have a reason we come together. Jesus didn't start the church. Jesus came to teach us. We started the church because we came together to support each other, to hear the stories, and to tell the stories of Jesus. That's what the church was about. Well, eventually, of course, the church became, like all human organizations, eventually that noble original purpose kind of gets lost, and the focus becomes the organization itself. It happens, you see it in schools, you see it in all kinds of organizations. Well, it certainly happened in the church. Okay? The church had gotten to a point where it was very structured, it was about the authority of the church, and at the time of Francis and Clare, who we're going to talk a little bit about, the church was very much a secular power as well as a religious authority. The Pope ruled land. He had armies. Not something that we think about today with churches. But very often, people have come along, and they have done this before Francis and after Francis and Clare, but they would come along and there would be people who would refocus back to the gospel, back to the beginning. At the beginning of the 13th century, there had been a number of movements to do this, but unfortunately what they did is they started out by criticizing the hierarchy of the church. And of course at that time, when you criticize the church, they attacked back very seriously. But Francis didn't do that. Francis didn't plan to reform the church at all. Francis' goal was to reform himself, to transform his life. He came from a wealthy merchant class, so that he could have done whatever he wanted. He could have married well, had raised a family. He wanted, at one point, could have been a knight or some, for some lord, because he was not nobility. But he did go to war at one time, and he saw the horrors of war, and he knew this couldn't be it. This can't be right. This can't be what we're supposed to do to each other. So he went through a period of transitioning. He was rejecting that role, that power that money has. That's why the focus on poverty. It really wasn't about being poor as much as it was about being humble, setting aside the influence and power that goes with the money that his family had. Claire came from nobility. Her family had status and the power that comes with that. Later on, she also then rejected that power, rejected that level of status, and realized, no, this is not the way it's meant to be. I'm sure all of you at some point have seen movies about Francis and Claire. Put all that stuff aside. Francis and Claire were not friends before. They were actually quite a big difference in age. When Francis started his transformation, Claire was still a child. But she did later meet him and hear him, and they had a great influence on each other. And what the focus was, living the gospel. This was what Francis finally decided. He's quoted at one point in saying, "When God gave me brothers, nobody told me what I should do. So I turned to live the gospel." And that is actually his very first rule that he wrote. They were all just simply quotes from Scripture, from the gospel. Living the gospel. There are places that Francis has actually been called the first Protestant, interestingly enough, several hundred years before the Reformation. And again, he wasn't protesting against the church, but he didn't change the church. He didn't change the structure. He didn't change the hierarchy. He influenced some of them, but mostly what he changed were people. The way people looked at the gospel. The Gospels were no longer something that was just studied or read at church in Latin, not in Italian either. They were something that were to be lived. And they were something that were supposed to be every day. This is where Francis and Claire had the most powerful impact. And Claire did it from her monastery. And yet she was a very powerful and influential person in her own right. She often gets overshadowed by Francis because he was more well-known. He's got more birth paths. But even without Francis, Claire probably would have been a very influential person either anyhow, because of her own, who she was. This concept of living the gospel is our vineyard. This is what we're meant to be and do. Francis and Claire are just two examples. There have been many others throughout history that we can look at over and over again to find out, how do we do this, living the gospel? It sounds scary. And it isn't just about those of us dressed in brown. Yeah, we have a certain way of life that we're supposed to live. But the core of that rule of life that for all of us is the gospel. And every person who follows Jesus is expected to follow this gospel. So what happens is our role then is to continue this work of Jesus on earth, building the kingdom of heaven here and now. It's not something we do all this so that when we die. No, it's about now. So our role is to create this kingdom of heaven now. If we look at our world, at times we think we're not doing a very good job. But actually, globally, we are indeed. A lot of research lately will tell you that worldwide, not in the United States right now, but worldwide, there is actually much less violence, much less animosity in the world than there used to be. It has reduced greatly. There are certain sections of the world where that's not totally true, and we still have a lot more work to do. Certainly, part of our goal is to create a society and a world where we don't have people running around shooting people, killing people, where our focus is more on caring and loving each other. It's also one of the reasons Francis and Claire chose to live their life the way they did is they chose to live as the lowest class of people at that time. there's a group of people, they were called the minores, the smallest ones, the less important ones. You know, there was nobility and the merchant class, and then the citizens of the city, and then the poor people in the city, and then there were the poor people outside the city. And they were the lowest class, they were the worst. And then, of course, there was also the lepers, who Francis did indeed work with a lot, at first especially, because it was a change for him. So they wanted to do away with all that class idea. And here in our nation, we are supposed to be a classless society. We know that isn't true. We know that there's still the wealth, the power of money brings. And we have to find the ways. We still know there's divisions, racial, ethnic divisions in our country. So our goal is to live this gospel, following Jesus, is we have to find the way to eliminate all that. It is each and every one of us our responsibility. And I can't tell you how you're supposed to do it. You have to discover that within yourself. But if you believe in following Jesus, then we are all expected to help change the world, to make the world a better place for everyone. We have some good examples of people like Francis and Claire and many other people in the past as well as in the present. We see people we know. All of us see people we know that we think, oh, these are really good people. This is someone that is living out a gospel way of living. And then we can use them. And it isn't all at once. Francis didn't become who he was all at one time. In fact, at first he was a little bit literal at times. And so his idea of rebuild my church, he actually started with stone and physically rebuilding the church. Figured out later it was really about helping people rebuild their lives, rebuild their relationships with God and with each other. That's what it was about. That's what each of us is about. And like Francis and Claire, we don't have to do this alone. We have, right here, a room full of people, but even beyond that, we have a community of people who are like-minded in the sense of we want to follow Jesus. We want to be followers of Jesus. And so we can support each other in making change in the world. Little change or big change, it doesn't matter, as long as we're moving forward and making change. We can leave this place today. What are the things you have to do? Basically, you have to ask yourself a question. Each of us, once we hear the gospel preached or listen to a homily of some kind about the gospel, the question is, so what? That's a very important question. So what? What does this mean about me and my life? How does that affect me? And I have to tell you, if you listen to the Gospels, whether it's at church on Sunday, in a Bible study group, or anywhere else, at home when you're reading Scripture on your own, if you don't feel a little bit challenged or a little bit uncomfortable, you're probably not paying close enough attention. The Gospels aren't supposed to make us just sit back and feel, oh, isn't the world wonderful? The Gospels are a challenge for each of us to find a way to change the world. Start by changing ourselves and change the world. And by the way, it's a lifelong process. We never get there. Each of us still struggles and strives. And that's okay, because that's all part of being human and being followers of Jesus. We do have some other examples for us at times. And some of them are sitting on the floor next to you. Actually, you have to understand, Francis wrote very little, hardly ever mentioned animals in any of his writings. He has become, the patron saint of all animals and everything. And every year, this week, there have been animal blessings all over the world. But that was not a big thing for him. What was big about animals, Francis chose about animals, was that from Gospels, where it says in the Gospel, Look at the birds of the air, look at the flowers of the field. They don't work, they don't do anything, but God provides for them. The animals for Francis were an example for us of trusting in God. Putting our trust in God that He will support and help us in all our endeavors. He will help us make this world a better place. But we have to do the work. We're the ones that have to do it. The other thing that a very good example for us is you can't sit down and look at your pet and not have an understanding of the concept of unconditional love. They're loving creatures, and they are an example for us. This is how we should look at the world. We should look at God with love and trust, and each other with love and trust. We need to build trust for each other. So, for today, we will do the blessing of the animals at the end. But the more important part is, what about my life is different because of following Jesus? What about my life is going to be different in what I do in the world? I'm still working on one of those decisions where I said, yes, I was going to do something and haven't done it yet. That we were reminded of important things, a really good reminder for me as well. Some things I had thought about when I was traveling, and I come back, Mom, I'm definitely going to do this. I haven't done it yet, so now I have to be committed myself. We always have to do that. We're human beings. We get caught up in other things, and all of a sudden we realize we're not doing everything we could or should. So we remind ourselves. We don't beat ourselves up. We don't consider ourselves bad people. We just move forward. So that's the thing I'm going to ask you all to do today, is walk away from here and ask yourself,